At the beginning of this year, I built an entire reading curriculum. I had ambitious plans, I had daily reading goals, and a stack of priority books, and I genuinely thought that this was going to play out in my reading life this year in a very specific way. I imagined quieter evenings, intentional reading, less screen time, and re-becoming the kind of person that ends every day reading. But over the last few months, something very interesting happened. That slower, analogue life that I had been craving has arrived, but it just didn't arrive through books alone like I thought. Unexpectedly, I found myself drawn to knitting and sewing projects, garden renovation plans, homemaking in general, and honestly just living a little more seasonally. So now we're coming to that halfway point through the year where I do like to look back on my reading goals that I set and see where I'm at and what I need to adjust. I want to do that, but I want to do it a little bit differently. So I thought I'd reflect on my year that has been so far, bring in a few of those questions from the mid-year freakout book tag, and really reflect on what my reading life has looked like over the last 6 months, and perhaps more importantly, what my reading life is looking like now. At the beginning of the year, I really did feel like I was stepping into this notion of being a mature reader. Not necessarily someone who read the most books, but someone who read intentionally, someone who knew their tastes and really honoured that. I wanted to become well-read in a way that felt personal to me. So I finally felt like I knew my reading tastes well enough that I could find books that both comforted me and challenged me depending on what I felt I needed that time. Books that stretched my thinking, my values, my understanding of the world, but would also be books that would bring me joy and entertainment. But most interestingly is the books that have stayed with me this year. I feel a lot of them are outside of the lanes that I had drawn for myself. And that hindsight has taught me something as well. That maybe being a mature reader isn't just about defining your taste down to 2 or 3 genres, but also being brave enough to step outside of the box and go with your gut and generally just be surprised by books on occasion. If you'd like to look at my original goals, I'll leave a link in the description below to the video I shared in February. But honestly, a lot of my goals weren't about numbers. They really were about rhythm, and I had a clear vision of what I thought my days were going to look like and what I wanted them to look like. Quieter evenings, more cups of tea while reading my books, less screen time, long and slow weekends filled with reading, and building a life that was slower and overall intentional. Now, if you've watched my goal video, you know that one of my big goals for the year was my Freedom After the Fall project, where I'm reading Paradise Lost by John Milton over a 12-month period. I genuinely thought that my reading life would revolve around this book and the themes within it, and it kind of has. It's just been in a very different way than I expected, especially because one of the bigger visions I had was about a slower and analogue life, which has arrived. It just didn't arrive the way I expected it to. So when I look back on the goals that I set for this year, a lot of them still are completely relevant to me and mean a lot to me. I did set a book goal of wanting to read 70 books this year, and I am behind that pace slightly. But what's interesting is a couple of months ago, I think I felt very guilty about that, but now I don't feel any guilt associated with that number, because even though I am behind on that goal of 70 books, I am so much further ahead in other areas of my life that I didn't really foresee. I think I've become much more aware of seasonality this year, which I have shared with you in a few different videos, and how some periods of life just naturally create more space for reading than others. One particular goal that I really wanted to get back to this year was re-becoming a person who ended the day with a book. I wanted it to be a consistent practice, that would be the last thing I would do as I wound down for the night. But in all honesty, most of my reading has happened in small pockets of time where I might be at the doctor's office or waiting somewhere else or on the commute on my way to work. Some of my best reading this year has happened in my 20-minute commute. And as much as my new hobbies occupy my mind, like knitting, I am not at a point where I'm going to be whipping out my knitting on the train or in the doctor's office just yet. I'm a few decades away from that. But I will read my book. And honestly, I think there is a lot of value in that everyday reading life. The biggest shift has probably been my Freedom After the Fall project. When I created it at the start of the year, I was naturally having these big pockets of time on the weekend where I would read for 2 to 3 hours in a stretch. And that's what I kind of thought I would continue to do with this project. I'm currently in month 4 of the project, which isn't too bad. I'm fairly happy with that, to be honest. And in fact, a lot of the companion books to the project that have themes around identity and freedom and temptation and what makes up a meaningful life have very much been an active part of my books that I've been reading. So in a strange way, I think the project has been shaping me. It's just that it's been showing up in actual practice of reading as opposed to reflection. But I'm not going to abandon it. I'm definitely going to keep going, and I'll share some thoughts at the end of how I'm going to start to really get my teeth into it. One goal that has actually gone very well is organising my shelves. I knew that I needed to have a well overdue clear out of books that I have read and didn't want to keep, and also try and get my TBR to a manageable size and process. So I've done a major clear out. I've got a lot of books that I have just taken off my shelves, and that process felt so freeing. I don't have a lot of connection to physical books. I guess the story is something I love, but the physical book itself is very easy for me to let go of. Especially if it's a book that I don't see myself rereading in the future, or a book that was kind of okay. I have no problem letting go of those. So I had all of these goals for my reading life, and then unexpectedly, a couple of months into the year, I started to create these other hobbies in my life that really pulled my attention away from reading. Hobbies that were not on my radar in February, and now I would say they are a central part of my life. They are something that I engage with on a daily basis. The first is that I taught myself how to knit beyond the basics. Another is that I didn't even own a sewing machine until late last year, when I decided to do a project of a gathered lampshade and I needed to make my own bias tape. So I bought a fairly cheap sewing machine, and I've done so many more projects on that. Making things that beautify our home or add to my wardrobe is so rewarding. Over the last few months, I've also been in a fairly large project as we've been renovating the front of our house, including the garden. So there's been a lot of thoughts around paint decisions and plant choices and really thinking about that space that we have. So suddenly the time that I would have naturally spent reading or with books evolved into me doing fairly large projects over a period of time. Projects that revolved around making things with my hands that are both useful and beautiful, whether it was a knitting project bag or a knitting needle organizer or a warm cardigan. I think that's part of the reason why these new pastimes resonated so well with me, because they were so tangible. And at the end of the time that I had been knitting or sewing or gardening, I had something physical that I could show for the time that I had spent and the things that I had made with my hands, things that didn't exist until I learnt the skills to bring them to fruition. And I could put it to work in my wardrobe, or I could gift something to a friend or a family member. This has been a pretty drastic change in my life. 4 months ago, I knew how to cast on and how to knit and how to purl. And now I've made a jumper, a sweater, I've made a cardigan, I've made beanies. I'm currently in the process of making a pair of socks, which is my next challenge. I've learned how to do an Italian bind-off, how to do a Latvian braid, and I love being able to see that progress in front of me. But alongside that satisfaction I was getting was a lot of guilt. I felt so much guilt initially that I should have been reading when I was dedicating so much time to these other projects. Especially because I deeply care about reading still. I still carry a book with me everywhere. I still read on my commute rather than pulling out my phone. But reading was no longer the centerpiece of this quiet time. And I think I had started to see reading as the right kind of quiet hobby, the most worthwhile one, the one that counted the most towards the kind of person I wanted to be. But spending an evening learning a new technique, knitting, or creating a bag that I can use in my everyday life, or planning a garden that is going to grow with us over the next 10 years are not shallow things. Those are all meaningful time spent. And I think that shift has also kind of changed the kind of books that have been appealing to me this year. I found myself gravitating more towards books that had momentum and emotional pull and atmosphere, books that could genuinely compete for my attention at the end of the day. So knowing all that context about my last few months, let's get into some of the questions about the books that I've been reading. And the first one would be, what is the best book I have read so far this year? I think the most obvious answer would be East of Eden by John Steinbeck. That I read over the summer and I loved it. It was everything you hear it is, and I desperately want to reread it. But I feel like that's a bit of an obvious decision, so I'm going to choose a different one. And there is another book that has really stayed on my mind in a much quieter way, really surprised me, and that was Devotion by Hannah Kent. This was incredibly immersive. It had all the hallmarks that I expect from Hannah Kent in her writing and more. Halfway through the novel, it transforms into something haunting and strange and something I genuinely did not expect, but it really made the book stay with me for longer. And it's a really great reflection of the kind of books that I have been gravitating towards, books that have an emotional pull, books that feel immersive, books that feel a bit lived in. And I think that connects well to what book has been the biggest surprise for me this year, because one of the biggest surprises this year is realizing that I actually do like magical realism. And in particular, I loved The Axeman's Carnival by Chidgey. It is funny and strange and unsettling, and it's actually narrated from the perspective of a magpie who has been adopted into a family, and the inappropriate things he says at times in very serious human situations was just it was unsettling, I think is the best way to describe it. Laughing at something and then realizing, oh, that's not funny. But I think that book really challenged the idea of what I thought I knew my reading taste to be. Because at the beginning of the year, I thought I knew my lane. I knew my lane of the books that I like, and I was going to stay within them. But some of the books that I really enjoyed this year have been outside of those lanes. And to be honest, in the words of Martha Stewart, that is a good thing. Another one of the questions is, what is my favourite sequel? And I was genuinely surprised to see that I had read 2 sequels this year. The one that I wanted to mention was The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is not the best book in the world, but for the moment when I read it, it meant a lot to me. And I did share a bit about it in my last video about how the books that I read or the books that I reached for when reading felt quite hard because my attention was so scattered. But The Wicked King is not a book I'd normally pick up. It is a fantasy book. It is very, very plot driven. But for the moment when I needed it, I really enjoyed it. It was a great read. Because when you spent the day working and then part of your evening knitting or doing a project of some sort, it's really important for me, well, it was important for me to find a book that really vied for my attention and was easy to pull me in. Because there have been many evenings where I've just said, I'll knit one more row. And if the book isn't enticing enough, I just wouldn't pick it up. It really reminded me of how valuable momentum can be at times. As much as I love character-driven novels, sometimes you need something else to propel you along. Another question is a new release that I was excited to get to this year. There's a couple on my mind, but one that I didn't really know about before I picked it up was Strangers by Belle Burdon. That was something that I did not have on my radar, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Yesteryear was one on my radar, and I'm glad I picked that up when I did as well. Both of those books were very immersive in different ways, but they kept me engaged. They kept me wanting to pick up the book and turn the page. And I think a memoir, I can see why that really fit in with that, because having an element of this is real life really made it a little bit more higher stakes, I guess. I do want to mention that one of my highest anticipated new releases this year was Jesus Christ Kinski from Benjamin Myers. And someone commented about the jump scare of this cover, and you were completely right. But it is within those pages too. It is the strangest, bonkers book that I've ever read. It is surreal and tense and unsettling again. Benjamin Myers is just insane. So I'm actually halfway through it at the moment, and it's not a DNF. It's just a book that I really have to psych myself up to get into the frame of mind for, because it feels like such a jigsaw at times. It doesn't feel like it has a linear thread like other books. But anyway, I will finish it, most definitely. But man, it is bananas. I think I just need to let it unfold a little bit slower, and I'll pick it up again soon. And this year's been interesting with unresolved reading experiences where I've realised that I don't have to have a book feel like it is a favourite or life-changing for it to be enjoyable, but also I don't have to keep reading if I don't want to. I can come back to it at any time. And maybe that's true of reading seasons as well. When I look back on it all, I think I've spent less time trying to read the books I think I should be reading and picking up books instead that really met me in that moment where I needed something engaging or something interesting to keep my attention. One of the harder questions was about what is one of the biggest disappointments this year so far. And I think for me that is a twofold issue, because the first thing is that I have become an unapologetic DNFer this year. I will start a book, and if I start to feel this book it's not fitting for me, I will go at least 50 pages before I make a decision to put it down, and perhaps come back to it at another time when I'm more in the mood for it, or just to put it down and never come back to it again. That decision is not an easy one, because sometimes you can feel emotionally tied to a book, but one that did happen with recently was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And I think the problem was that I started reading this book, I got in 100 pages, I forced myself to go 100 pages, but it just didn't work for me. And I think the reason is not the book's fault, it's my fault, because I knew the story, I had seen the movie, I knew the twists and the reveals that were going to happen. So when I was reading the book, and his books are so interior that it wasn't working for me. So I had to just put it down and just say, it's not a come back again later book. I'm not going to pick that book up again. But like I said, it was not the book's fault. It was my problem. I just was not as impressed or surprised by it, I think because I knew the plot. It just wasn't worth my time to keep reading. And finally, a book that made me happy or made me cry, I think the one that stands out is, again, the Axeman's Carnival. I was laughing out loud in that book at some of the things the magpie would do or say in very uncomfortable human moments that were just hilarious. There was a strange combination of dark humour, absurdity, really sharp observations. That made me laugh. So one of the last questions of the Mid-Year Freakout tag is what books I want to get to before the end of the year. And to be honest, at the start of the year, I set a list of 5 books that were kind of high priority for me, and I haven't read any of them. So I don't want to add more books to that list. But within that list, I definitely do still want to get to Persuasion by Jane Austen, The Once and Future King by T.H. or T.S. White, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, and I think maybe a couple of additions would be, I am definitely looking forward to reading Gilead, which is actually the last companion book in the Freedom After the Fall project, so I'm not going to read that till later in the year. But also The Wall by Marlin Hofstadter. I think I really want to read that. After enjoying I Who Have Never Known Men and some other dystopian speculative fiction like books, I think that will be a really good one for me. And I guess maybe that tells you the kind of reading mood I'm in for the rest of the year. I think I want to get back to those books that are slower, more reflective, more immersive, and to be driven by character more than just plot, like I have been over the last few months. Because I'm no longer attaching the pressure to them that I may have at the start of the year when I felt that guilt about not reading enough because my time was being spent elsewhere. And I think that's probably why I do love doing a mid-year reset so much. This isn't about me overhauling my reading entirely. It's not a dramatic return to reading, drop everything else. For me, this is a recalibration. It's about finding rhythm and balance, and I really want my reading to no longer compete with the other things I want to do. I want my reading to sit alongside all of my other hobbies and all of the other interests in my life and really have it integrated into everyday life rather than competing with other things. I've also naturally found that over the last few months, I've been reading less books at one time. So in the past, I would have read up to 5 books. I would have had 5 books on the go at one time. And lately it's been 1, maybe 2. I've found that I'll pick up a book and I'll want to read that until the end before I start another one. So that's been interesting. It's not been about a high turnover of quantity of books. It's really about having a sustainable reading life and having those books kind of just come along with me as I go through my day. Something else that I'm really trying to remember is that my reading project for Freedom After the Fall I'm not behind, I'm not failing at that, Paradise Lost and reading Paradise Lost is still very deeply important to me. I just think I need a different strategy in place than what I originally thought was going to happen. As I said, there was no real time frame for this. I could kind of finish it in as much time as I needed, but I do think that I need to have some sort of soft deadline where I'm either getting through one book a month or taking 2 months to do one section, because otherwise it'll just keep getting pushed to the side. Another thing I really want to do is, because my weekends and those slow mornings where I'm reading have changed, where I'm doing other projects, I think I need to dedicate a few hours one night a week to this reading project where I'm not multitasking, I am not watching television, I'm just spending time reading Paradise Lost or the companion books to keep moving forward with it. Because that's what this entire reset is. It's not about optimizing my goals to have them at the end of the year being checked off in a nice list. It's about building a life where reading naturally has a place alongside all of the other things I've come to unexpectedly love this year. Finding a quieter rhythm, finding balance where everything fits in and where it feels sustainable. So that's my mid-year reading reset. There's been a lot happening. I hope that kind of gives a bit of clarification of where my head has been, where I'm moving for the next few months, and I hope you found it interesting, maybe enjoyable, but thank you so much for joining me. I really cannot believe we are halfway through the year already. I did not expect this to be where I was 5 months ago, so I'm excited to see where we're at the end of the year. But thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful week of reading ahead, and I'll speak with you soon. Bye.